Today we're going to be covering the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's going to be our first hero story for the semester. We've done our introduction to heroes. We did it in 2 parts. There was a lot of material there, but this is good background for what we're going to start to cover now as we get into the actual material. And Gilgamesh, of course, is the best place to begin because Gilgamesh is, you probably know, the very first hero story, the world's oldest hero in world literature. And even though it was lost for several thousand years, it was rediscovered with the advent of modern archaeology and has been brought to light once again. And it's a wonderful story. I don't know how you feel about it. Those of you that have read it, whether you've read the original or translation of the original epic or an abridged version like you might find in the textbook. I'll tell you up front, when I first read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I wasn't that impressed. I found it a little bit dull. It's definitely shorter than something like the Iliad or the Odyssey, and not nearly as much action or adventure in the story. There's only a few scenes where you've got some interesting stuff going on, but as I reread it and looked at it over the years and analyzed it from different points of view, it started to mean more to me, and a lot more value, I think, can be found in the text. And now I actually think it's quite brilliant. So hopefully you will appreciate it more by the end of this lecture than you may have when you read it initially. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off by going through background on the epic. We've covered the epic in their introduction to mythology and myth. We also covered it briefly in the introduction to hero myths, but I'm going to go back and we're going to take a look once again at what an epic is, and then we are going to talk about different types of epics, which is something I don't think I've covered at all with you guys up to this point. So let's take a look at this background. Here's our definition of epic one more time: a long narrative poem usually recounting great heroic events of the past. Okay, so that tells us a couple things. It tells us that it's going to be a long story. It's going to tell us that it's written in a poetic fashion, and it's going to involve the content like we've been talking about, legendary material, historical material, because remember, legends are purported to be history. They're presented as history. So there's always the question, and we'll address this as we go through various stories for the rest of the semester. What's the historic background? Is there something in the story that might be historically true? I always bring up King Arthur in that context because that's kind of the fun one to deal with. Was there a real King Arthur? You could actually do the same thing with Gilgamesh, as we'll see shortly. I'll do a background for the culture that produced Gilgamesh and address it very briefly there, but let's dig into epic a little bit more. I'm going to give you some distinguishing features that you can find in this type of poetry. And the first one is the idea of meter. When you're talking about poetry, invariably, you're going to have to talk about this idea of meter, which is a rhythmic pattern, the way the poem is composed in various stanza of different lengths that have kind of a pattern that repeats from stanza to stanza. You don't necessarily want to think of poetry as necessarily rhyming, okay, though the word rhyme and rhythm are obviously related, but the poetic style is really important for a couple reasons. It's important as a functional element when we talk about the first type of epic I'll get to very shortly. It's also a stylistic feature that is going to be used even when it no longer has a functional purpose. Okay, so when I get to the 2 types of epics, I will distinguish them based on how meter is either functional or merely stylistic. Okay, that's going to be the big distinguishing factor between the 2 styles of epic. Anyways, when we talked about Greek epic, for instance, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, or even Latin poetry like the Aeneid, which we're going to read later on this semester, we're talking about a particular meter that is used among the classical world, which was modeled on Homer's meter, which is called dactylic hexameter. I may introduce you to exactly what that means later on when we get to the Iliad. I may not do that. I don't really know, but it tells you pretty much how many syllables there are per line of verse, and whether they're long or short syllables and stuff like that. So remember, this is stuff that would be read aloud or actually sung aloud and accompanied sometimes with a musical instrument like a lyre. Okay, and the next thing, again, you've got meter, which is the poetic fashion, and then the length, which has to do, again, with how long the poem is. It's not a lyric poem. It's not an ode. It's something that has great length. And again, that's a relative term. Like I said, the Gilgamesh epic is not very long. The Epic of the Iliad is, about 16,000 lines long, so it's actually pretty lengthy. And that's not nearly as long as the world's longest epic, which is the Mahabharata, which I think is something like 100,000 lines or more. I forget the exact number, but it dwarfs something like the Iliad. And if you were to pick up a copy of the Iliad, you'd probably say, oh, this is kind of a big book. So you can imagine picking up a copy of the Mahabharata. I'm guessing most of you have not read that one. Okay, so its length, its grand scale, it's much longer. And if you're going to recite this to entertain, it would take hours or days to get through something like this. So you can imagine Homer, singing the song to his audience would have to continue on maybe tomorrow and then the next day to finish up the story. So it's not something you're going to sit down and watch very briefly, or listen to rather. You also have elevated diction, so that means the language that's used in the poetry is kind of lofty, it's high style, and it reflects the audience that a lot of the stuff was originally presented to, which would have been the nobles, right? The kings, the queens, the royal families, the aristocracy, okay? So that is another feature of epic. It's not the ordinary language. Obviously, it's not prose, but it's well beyond that. You also have elaborate oration, where you have characters giving these long, complicated speeches. And the speeches are often repeated in various places. Okay, so it's not going to be a very straightforward thing. It's usually a well-crafted speech. So next feature, like I said, I'm going to give you 10. This should be number 5 if I'm counting correctly, is the use of simile and epithets. Simile is a comparison, right? We're saying something is like something else. It's usually an elaborate comparison, but that depends on the poet, depends on the type of poetry we're dealing with. I'll give you a couple examples in just a second. And then the epithet, if you have no idea what an epithet is, it's just like a fancy nickname. It could be a descriptive phrase that's usually attached to a figure, like a personality, like Achilles. In the Iliad, he's often called swift-footed Achilles. That would be an epithet, swift-footed. Gives you a little bit of a description of what he's like, but it also sets up the type of phrase that could fit into the poetry in various places based on, again, the meter. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The simile, I'll give you 2 examples. And these are going to come up at the same time, but the first one, the top one here, is very, very simple, right? She flew away like a bird into the air. It's giving a description, comparing the way this particular individual has departed, comparing it to a bird, right, flying away. The second simile is much more complicated, and this one comes from the Aeneid, and I like this particular simile because of how elaborate it is. I want you to see just how complicated these similes can be. Virgil writes, "And just as often when a snake, surprised upon the high road and run over by a brazen wheel that slants across him, or else beaten by a traveler's heavy blow and left half dead and mangled by a stone, will try in vain to run away and wreathes its body in long coils, so did the ship move slowly on her slow oars." Okay, so it's a description of a ship which you could picture as being crippled by a storm. It's, not sailing as smoothly as it ought. And the comparisons with this snake, right, beaten up by a stone on a road, right, just trying to get out of the way and get off the road. So it's really a great descriptive comparison, but you can see how the poet can really play with the language and do something that's really elaborate. Now, how elaborate the simile is going to be is also relative to the type of epic we're dealing with. Okay, so I still will unpack this a little bit further, so bear with me. Take me a while to get around to the 2 types. The next is an invocation of the muse. A lot of times this poetry is going to have the invocation of a divinity or some kind of god to inspire the poet. A lot of times the poem will open with this invocation. If you've never heard of the muses are the 9 goddesses of inspiration for the arts. Okay, there's a muse for epic poetry. There's a muse for history, etc. Some people even place the famous lyric poetess Sappho into the category of muses, even though that she's not a divine character. She's actually an actual poet from the archaic period of ancient Greece, but she's classified with the 9 muses. She's often called the 10th muse. So Homer often opens up not often, in his writings opens up with an invocation of the muse. So it's almost like this poetry is divine, not necessarily to the same extent that you might think of a religious text from a religion like Islam or Christianity as inspired, right? You've probably heard of the idea that the Bible is inspired by God, or the Quran is inspired by God. It's a little bit different, but it still has that aspect to it. Okay. The next one is this idea of catalogs. Epics very often have these long lists of things. In the Iliad, there's the famous catalog of the ships, which lists all the different city-states in Greece that have sent troops to Troy. Could be a little dull. I mean, you get to those places, most students skim over that material and get back to the story, but these are actually interesting in that they can preserve some little fragments of history. This is why archaeologists and historians concentrate a lot of their attention on things like the catalogs. What cities are they talking about? Where are these cities located? You can often get a glimpse of the past through things that are recorded in the catalogs. They will often be didactic in nature, right? This is a word we looked at before, which has to do with the function of teaching. They're instructional. And they will begin, like good story, with a statement of their theme. So the Iliad will open, this is about, I'm going to sing about the anger of Achilles, right? And they're going to deal with the big questions, right? Fundamental human concerns, cultural concerns, and they're going to teach the community and teach a history, okay? Or at least what they want to be a history, all right? A cultural identity. So those are the first 8. Last 2. Next, heroic legend. That was part of our definition, that these epics are usually going to focus on hero stories. So they're rooted in history. They're believed to be true by the audience. They focus on a character that is a warrior, a traveler, or a king that embodies the values of the civilization or culture. And then they're going to give you the adventures of that character, the great deeds. All right, so the very last one is the fact that it usually begins in the middle, in medias res. I gave you that term as well in the past. Right into the central things is literally what it means from the Latin. So the narrative is going to begin after the action has already started. And it's then going to use the flashback, which some people think is used or overused in movies and stories today. But it's not a new thing. This has been there from the beginning of epic. I talked about how Star Wars starts with episode 4, right? We did a little bit of analysis of Star Wars, the entire series, and episode 4 was the first movie they made. This is a movie poster from the day. It looks a little different than the way the logo is currently, and notice it's billed just as Star Wars. That's all that it read. There was no Star Wars A New Hope. There was no Star Wars Episode 4. You didn't even find out that it was Episode 4 until you get into the beginning of the movie, and as the text runs across the screen the way it does off into the distance, into outer space, it says Episode 4, and everybody in the audience, of course, is left puzzling, well, did I miss something? Right? Well, in a way, yes, but in a way, no, because that's exactly where it was supposed to start. Of course, today when you look up the movie, whether it's on a DVD or streaming service, it's billed as Star Wars Episode 4. It's called A New Hope. Again, this is the technique of beginning in the middle, which Lucas, I think, intentionally did to go along with this tradition that has been there from the very beginning. Okay? So that's a little bit of an overview as to the elements that are in, or characteristics in epic poetry. And by the way, the other picture there, which I didn't even point out, is a scene from the Iliad on red figure vase painting, ancient Greek red figure vase painting showing Achilles and Hector in combat, kind of the culmination of the great epic of Homer. All right, here are the 2 types. First type of epic is called the oral epic. The second type is called a literary epic. And already I think you guys can figure out what the difference is between the 2. So let's start with the oral epic first. I'll give you the primary characteristics and also the fact that it's called a primary epic. Right? As opposed to, I guess you could probably figure that the literary epic is not going to be primary, but it will be called a secondary epic. So what makes something an oral epic or a primary epic? Number 1, these are the stories that originated in pre-literate societies. The stories are passed down by word of mouth. Rather, I should say the epic poetry is passed down in some fashion through oral tradition. Right? It's not a written tradition. There are these singers that would perform something, and they wouldn't be working from a text in front of them, right? Now, how they do this is a matter for scholarship and debate. Did they memorize the story, and then they just memorize it so well that they can recite it, right? Or did they do something different, which we might call oral composition? One thing that they probably all had access to were certain fragments of historical past, certain plot points that they would be able to incorporate. So imagine them not memorizing the story. As a matter of fact, we could just talk about memorization very briefly, because I think it's one way that a lot of people assume the poems are passed down. Just memorization, pass it on, somebody else memorizes it and passes it on. How many of you guys have played the game telephone before? Usually in grade school or even high school. I remember doing it. Yeah, I knew some of you had, right? And what happens in the game? You get somebody that starts with like a sentence or a short story or something really brief. They tell it to somebody, then that person tells it to somebody that didn't hear it the first time, and then that person will tell it to the next person, and on and it goes, however many people you have to play the game. And by the end of the game, what usually happens? The last person that hears the story has to tell it to the first person, and they compare the two. And what's changed? What happens over the course of the game? Yeah, it gets confused. It gets mixed in with other things, and then people will say, well, this is how oral tradition works. You pass a story down, and it's bound to change over time. And I think to a degree that might be right. The stories do morph and change over time, but the degree that they change and how radically they change, I don't think is necessarily reflected in the game telephone, because one thing about telephone that's very different from an oral tradition is the people hearing the story and passing it on in telephone have only heard it once. They're passing it on immediately without spending time to memorize it. And a lot of times it's not taken very seriously, where they will intentionally add something or change something, to kind of have fun with the game. Now, in an oral tradition where you actually have memorization take place, you can imagine it would be very serious. You would hear the story probably multiple times in your life growing up, and you memorize it with the intention of trying to accurately transmit it as best you can. So if there was a memorization process involved in an oral tradition, the chances of there being radical changes, probably not as much as you would think. But again, that would depend on the culture and various other elements. So the big thing is most people don't believe that stories like the Iliad, the Odyssey, maybe even the Epic of Gilgamesh came through rote memorization. There is another theory that has to do with what's called oral composition. And this would be where the poet kind of improvises. You kind of make the story, not the story, but you make the poem up on the fly. Kind of like, a rap battle or something like that. You just go in there and you got, the beat, and then you start going. And you put the thing together, and, it's kind of a skill. That in itself, is an art. So let's talk about some of the conventions that would be necessary to do this kind of stuff like oral composition. Yeah, rap battles in history. Good. All right, so one thing you probably would have to memorize is the plot. You want to know what the story is about, and that would be something that would be pretty standard, all right? So the poet has a plot in mind, basic plot points. Then they get the meter, like I said, dactylic hexameter for Homer, right? So you've got a particular rhythm. Whatever you're going to say has to fit into that rhythm, which in oral poetry is a very functional thing, It is not just about style. It actually has a purpose. There has to be a meter present in order to pull this off. It's going to ensure that you transmit the poetry with limited variation. You're still going to have some variation, but it's going to prevent radical shifts and changes. And then you have all these stable phrases. These would be other things that you would plug in to the meter of the poem, which would be 2 or more word phrases that would fit into a rhythmic condition to express a particular idea. And the theory is that these phrases have a certain economy to them. That's a formula. That no 2 phrases that express the same idea will fit in the same spot. Because if you want to communicate the same idea, maybe there's a longer phrase, maybe there's a shorter phrase to capture it. And as you're reciting the poetry or composing the poetry, if you can only fit one phrase in at a time that will match the rhythm. And if there's another phrase that fits, very often it would express the opposite idea. So you're not going to accidentally put in the opposite of what you want to communicate. So the phrases will kind of be useful for kind of stringing it along, like a whole collection of Legos that you're just putting in. Certain Legos will fit here. Other ones that are too long won't fit in that spot. It's the same idea with the metric thing. And then you've got the theme, the long descriptions that are repeated over and over again. So for instance, the Iliad, 16,000 lines, the vast majority of the poem is repeated, and over and over again in different places. So if somebody, says something that they're going to go talk to so-and-so and this is what they're going to say, when you get to the spot where they actually say it to the person, they're going to repeat almost verbatim the exact same thing. Okay, so it's these long formulaic repetitions. So you could usually pick up whether or not you're dealing with an oral poem when you have these really stringent repetitions throughout the poem. Okay, here's some examples of oral poetry. Oh, and by the way, the ability to do this seems to disappear with the introduction of literacy. People that have studied oral composition in the 20th century, because there are still people that can do this. But it's interesting that the people that can compose like this on the fly generally are illiterate people. There seems to be a connection between learning how to read and write and losing the ability to compose orally. Okay? So, kind of interesting. Now, here's some examples of oral poetry. You could probably jump on the internet and find a whole list of great epics from different cultures around the world, but just a very short list of those that would fall into the category of oral epic. Gilgamesh, today, that's an oral epic. That's 20th century BC. This is our earliest one. The Enuma Elish, which we studied briefly, that's the Epic of Creation from Babylonia. It goes back to about the 18th century BC. Iliad and Odyssey, even the Theogony of Hesiod, which we looked at with Prometheus, those are all 8th century BC most likely. The Mahabharata, the world's longest epic, 5th century BC. The Ramayana, we'll be covering that later this semester, 3rd century BC. Beowulf, which we'll also be doing. Now we're jumping into 8th century AD, and then Nibelungenlied, which we won't be reading, but we will be referring back to when we do the story of Sigurd, 13th century. So you have these oral traditions, and eventually these stories were put into writing. That's why we have them preserved. So the dates that I'm giving you, kind of when these things were put into a written form, and you can imagine that the oral tradition went centuries earlier. Some of them several hundred years or more. Anyways, second type would be the literary epic, or secondary epic, and these are not the product of oral performance. These are not composed improvisationally by a poet that does this kind of work. This would be composed by a poet who is literate, who sits down, pen and paper or whatever, and decides to create something that is new and original. Now, they could be using old stories, legends, and different material that they've inherited through maybe an oral tradition, but the poem itself is unique and original, right? And when it does employ rhythm, like for instance, this particular photo, by the way, not photo, but painting, is a picture of Dante in the red, and behind him is the great Latin poet Virgil. If you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, this is Virgil was the guide of Dante into the underworld in the Divine Comedy. Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, works in dactylic hexameter verse, which is the same verse that Homer uses. But Virgil is writing something completely original. So when I gave you that simile earlier, that long comparison between the ship and the snake, that's Virgil writing. This is not formulaic poetry. This is something that, he can make it as complicated as he wants. He could play with the language with no real boundaries because he's not working with kind of a plug-in formula system. He's using dactylic hexameter merely for its style, not for its function. Okay? So this is going to be very different. It's not going to be filled with repetition throughout. So the Aeneid, very different from the Iliad. Oh, and by the way, an analogy to maybe capture this idea of oral composition and the importance of the meter, I usually use this as a picture. How many of you have songs that you really love and you kind of memorize the words and you want to remember the lines of the music, but you have for some reason forgotten the beat, or you forgot the actual music, right? You're just trying to remember the words by themselves and have found it really difficult. I don't remember how the song goes. I don't remember what the next line is. And then as soon as you remember the music, you immediately remember the lyrics. How many have had that experience? Okay. It's pretty common, I think, if you're a music fan. So that's kind of the right. I knew some of you had. This is basically what it's like. That's why the meter is so important. The meter helps you in producing the lyrics or the poetry. Okay, not so with literary epic. It's just about style. Anyways, here's some examples of literary epics. Most of these we're not going to be reading. Bellum Punicum, which is about the Punic Wars. This is an old Latin epic. the Annales by Ennius, and then the Aeneid of Virgil, that one we will be dealing with. So those first three are all Latin epics, as is Pharsalia. The Shahnameh we'll be talking about later. It's a Persian epic from the 11th century A.D. Deals with the story of Rostam for the most part. We'll be looking at Rostam and Esfandyar later this semester. Brut by Laemon. That one is dealing with the King Arthur tradition. There's an epic dealing with King Arthur. Parzival, a Germanic one based on the story of the Holy Grail, Divine Comedy of Dante that I just mentioned. So we're going up through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance here. Orlando Furioso, Paradise Lost. You may have heard of some of these. Paradise Lost is pretty famous. But out of these, we're just going to be touching later on the Aeneid, the Shahnameh, the Arthurian material, though we're not going to be reading the Brut or Parzival, and then that might be it from this particular list. Anyways, I wanted to give you an exposure to a few different types that fall into different categories. Okay, it's taken me a little bit of time to get around to Gilgamesh, but we're finally there. So let's talk about the culture first that produced the world's oldest epic. This will be the ancient Sumerians. How many of you have studied world civilization or world history and have come across ancient Sumeria? Here's where it was located. You might not remember a lot about it, but most people can say, that's Mesopotamia, right? This is a very, very rough map of Mesopotamia. The lower portion of Mesopotamia is ancient Sumeria, or Sumer. Southern portion, you get some number of cities there. I'm going to just give you a rough chronology, focusing primarily on the city of Uruk, only because, well, for a few reasons. Uruk was the earliest city that we have from ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most important early centers of culture in Mesopotamia, and it's also the setting of our poem. Gilgamesh is king of Uruk. Now, the city dates to its earliest phases at least as far back as 4000 BC. This early Uruk period eventually develops into a full-fledged city by the time we get to 3500, and we can call this the beginning of civilization. So from 35 to 3100 BC, we call this the late Uruk period. And Uruk was the strongest, probably the largest and most important city in Sumeria at the time. On the map, it doesn't say Uruk, by the way. It says Erech, E-R-E-C-H. It's just a different spelling. Because, again, all of our spellings are transliterations from the cuneiform into a modern language. So there's no right or wrong way to do that. The next period is called the early dynastic phase, or the early dynastic period, 2900 to about 2350 BC. And in this period, you have the rise of royal houses, kingship that passed down through the family. And between 29 and 2800, there is a dynasty that rules at Uruk, most likely, that is going to include our king Gilgamesh. We have lists of kings that date from 2900 to about 2100 that are preserved by later generations. And in the first dynasty of Uruk, we have Gilgamesh as the fifth king of the dynasty. Right? We've got Meshki-Angashir, who's supposedly the first of his kind. He's the first king, the founder of Uruk, according to tradition, and the son of the god Utu. So it's the idea that these guys in this early phase are semi-divine. They've got their authority from the gods up above. Jumping down to Lugalbanda, that's the father of Gilgamesh that we know. And then Gilgamesh doesn't succeed his father, but he's the fifth in line. And if you're going to place him chronologically, you could put him around 2700 BC. Now, does that mean this was a real person? Possibly. Okay, a lot of people do keep open the possibility that we have some historical information, at least a name, minimally. And then, if this was a real person, he obviously had enough of an impact on his city and culture to have stories told about him after his death. And then you have the story written down probably about 700 years later, where you have a good amount of time for the legend to grow and become embellished and become a really interesting tale. Probably not a lot to do with the original figure, though there may be certain glimpses in the story that refer back to an actual Gilgamesh. So I'm always open to the possibility that some of these guys are historical. So I'll say, yeah, Gilgamesh probably lived. 2500, you have the unification of Sumeria first take place. You've got the Akkadian Empire, founded around 2350 by Sargon the Great. This is a foreign dynasty, a Semitic people that end up taking over all of Sumeria and later all of Mesopotamia. And that's going to have a big impact on the future of the region. Then the last phase is the Neo-Sumerian period from 2200 to about 2000, and then the collapse. Sumer falls as a civilization by 2000 BC, but the culture remains. The culture is going to impact all the peoples that take over the region after them, particularly the Semitic groups, like the Akkadians. Okay, the Akkadian Empire. That's where we get the Akkadian language from. And the copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh that was first unearthed in the 19th century was a version in the Akkadian language, which would be the language of Babylon, like the Enuma Elish that we talked about several weeks back. All right, so let's talk about the epic now, what we know of it. Again, historical Gilgamesh, maybe around 2700 BC. The oral tradition passed on and then put into written form probably around 2000. Then it's translated. It was a phenomenon. I mean, it was one of the most popular stories of the ancient Near East, and it was translated in multiple languages, so Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian. So it was not just something localized into southern Mesopotamia. It was spread out from there. All right, the Hittites, the Hurrians, we're talking northern Mesopotamia into Anatolia. We even have references to Gilgamesh in Latin poetry and Greek stuff later on. So the legend of Gilgamesh was widely spread, well known. Now, some things that have been added into the epic, most people think the flood story. Okay, so at the end of the story of Gilgamesh, we have the story of the flood. A lot of people think that was a separate tradition that got woven in a certain place. And some people even believe that the whole character of Enkidu, that was an independent legend that was woven in as well. I'm going to be a little bit skeptical on that only because I think the epic as we have it would make very little sense without the Enkidu. I think Enkidu is such a central element in the story. I can't imagine the Epic of Gilgamesh without Enkidu as part of it. Anyways, 7th century BC, as our most complete surviving documents come from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. This was a library found, built in the 7th century and also destroyed in the 7th century. 612, the Medes, Babylonians, Scythians, they come in, they sack the city of Nineveh, destroy the library, and thanks to this destruction, we have the preservation of the tablets. Okay, this is the Akkadian version. Shinleki Unini is a name attached to it. I don't know if he's necessarily the same as a Homer would be to the Iliad, but possibly an editor who was involved in this version. And then, like I said, it was essentially lost. I mean, there's still remembrance of Gilgamesh and stories spread around, but it was lost by the end of the ancient world and then rediscovered in the 19th century. The excavations at Nineveh took place in 1845. Those were begun. You have about 25,000 clay tablets found in the Nineveh library, and then it was published in 1862. At least the first outline of the story was published in 1862, and thanks to that, we have awareness of the long-lost epic. Okay, so let's talk about the stages. Here's how I'm going to handle the story. Instead of just going through the plot, which I'm going to have to do, I want to cover it as a transformation tale. Hero stories are about transformation, initiation, development of a dynamic figure, and I think Gilgamesh is a wonderfully dynamic character. So the stages we're going to look at the story according to are these. The abusive king, and I'm going to ask you guys a little bit of feedback in your texts because I'm assuming you've read the story, so be thinking about why I'm calling him an abusive king. Then he's going to evolve into the brother, the mourner, the seeker, the failure, the acceptor, and at the end of the story, the immortal king. And what I mean by immortal king, we'll have to wait and see because clearly he does not attain the immortality that he seeks. I mean, that's the ultimate quest in the story, right? He is a mystical hero who is seeking immortality on his journey. And not to spoil the story for those that haven't read it, but he doesn't get it. Okay? At least in a certain sense, he doesn't get it. Anyways, it's a movement from a chaotic personality to an ordered personality. This is, again, based on that whole idea of chaos, cosmos, chaos, order, nature, culture, wild, civilized, all the dichotomies that we've been looking at since we introduced the trickster and creation myths. Okay, so we're just building on that theme. So let's get into it. The abusive king. Why is he an abusive king? What do we know about Gilgamesh when the poem opens up? What type of man is he? We know he's a king, a rapist. Good. Yes, that I think is a very accurate and appropriate term because his biggest crime is, at least the one that they emphasize in the poetry most clearly, you get the idea that he does a number of things that are abusive, but what's the actual thing that he does? He doesn't just run around raping people. I mean, he does, but it's a particular prerogative that he seems to believe he has. It's a right that he's claiming as king. And just to give you a little bit of a background, he's powerful, right? I mean, this is a guy that is part God, 2/3 God, according to the text. So if he wants to do what he does, who's going to stop him? And that's really the problem. It's an abuse of power. And what he's claiming the right to is to sleep with the brides on their wedding. At least that seems to be implied as the right of the king to do something like that, what's called prima nocta. What he does is he does this anytime he wants. He just walks into the home of a citizen of Uruk and he takes the wife from the husband without the husband being able to do anything to stop it or protect her. Okay? He's blind, he's selfish, he's abusive. He can't see beyond his own desires, his cravings, and he steps on people to get what he wants. This is not a good man. So we're kind of off to a bad start with Gilgamesh. The clip that I'm showing you, by the way, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Braveheart. The little gif that's being played here is a scene where King Edward, who is the monarch, throws a man to his death because the king has the ability to do what he likes with his power. And the reason I kind of picked this particular scene is because if you've seen the movie Braveheart, one of the things that the king decides he's going to do to basically abuse the Scottish people is to invoke the right of prima nocta, where the English can sleep with the brides on their wedding night before the husband does. So that issue comes up. And that's one of the things a lot of historians have wondered about as to whether or not that kind of practice was ever actually used historically. You know, we find it in literature like Gilgamesh, but who knows if that was actually ever a practice. It's definitely not a good thing. And the people of Uruk are upset. They're so upset they need relief. They need to do something about this guy that's going to just walk all over them. And they turn to the gods, right? They pray to the gods for relief from Gilgamesh. And the gods hear their prayer. And that's important. So, introducing the answer to the prayer, and that's Enkidu. The gods say, okay, we're going to send relief to the people. We're going to create a man who is going to go down to Uruk and deal with Gilgamesh. And we got to create somebody that is as powerful as Gilgamesh, as strong as, basically the mirror image of Gilgamesh. That's how you want to think of Enkidu. He's described as a beast of a man. As a matter of fact, he's very much more than just a beast. He lives like a beast. But you can also call him a twin. Okay? So the gods are petitioned. They create a new life, a twin to Gilgamesh. But what they do with him is they place him in the wilderness. They don't send him to Uruk. So when he's first introduced to the world of the earth, he's a wild man. He's living like an animal. And what other things is he doing? Because it's going to cause a problem for certain men from Uruk that are out there in the wilderness trying to make a living, trying to do what they need to do. Who does he interrupt? Who does he bother? And I'm trying to set up a pattern. Gilgamesh is in the city, bothering the people. Enkidu is put into the wilderness, and he's bothering some people as well. Who are these people? And what are they going to do about it? They're the hunters, right? They're trying, like I said, right, to make a living. They're not. It's not sport hunting. They're doing this to survive. This is a way of life. And he's breaking their traps. He's setting the animals free. He's doing everything to interfere with their livelihood, and they now turn to somebody for help. You could even say they turn to the gods for help. Because what they end up doing is they go to the city of Uruk and they get a hold of a priestess, right? Now, the hunters get this priestess who's going to come out to seduce this wild man, Enkidu. Her name is Shamhat. And she is going to use her sexuality to lure him in. She is going to entice him. She is going to get him to fall in love with her. And then she's going to make a man out of him. Let's just use that phrase because, we use that phrase in the context of, introduction to sexuality, right? But in a very literal way, she's going to try to civilize him. She's making him turning him from a beast into a man. Now, the idea of the priestess, I should also let you know if you haven't read other translations of the story of Gilgamesh, she's not always called a priestess. She's often called a prostitute. And that may sound weird. Why are you able to translate as priestess or prostitute? Those sound like almost opposites, right? We think of a priestess as somebody very holy and a prostitute, somebody that's a little bit questionable. But if you understand a little bit about the religion of the day, a religion particularly associated with certain goddesses, and she's a servant of the goddess Ishtar, okay, or Inanna. The city of Uruk had two main patron gods, Anu. There was a temple precinct set up for Anu within the city of Uruk, but there was also another precinct to the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar in the Akkadian, and she's a goddess of love, sexuality, beauty, and war. And the priestesses involved in the worship of the goddesses of love very often practice certain types of ritual sexuality. So when they go and get the priestess, they're literally going to an expert on seduction, okay, and sexuality, and they're going to bring her out. So you could translate it either way. It's fair. And it works, okay, because he starts to enjoy this experience. He starts to act like a man. He starts to eat human food, and he's introduced to human drink, and eventually shaves and dresses like a man. And he has made a break. He's transformed from wild into civilized. And then before he goes to the city, he finally helps hunters out by, killing some of the more ferocious animals and assisting. So that's kind of the transition point for Enkidu. And then he goes to Uruk. Now, when he gets to Uruk, I'm skipping over all the, oracular dreams and stuff that kind of warn Gilgamesh ahead of time that this guy is going to be coming for him. So, I'm kind of just hitting the high points of the story, but if you've read the text, you should be aware of these other things, all the gods operating in the background. But when he first gets to the city, he's going to encounter Gilgamesh and block his path. He's in the gateway, and Gilgamesh is coming by, and Enkidu puts his foot out, basically trips him up. And he now takes on this role of the adversary. Now remember, hero stories have to have an adversary, which I said is often the villain. It's a challenge. It's something that the hero has to respond to and react to that is going to cause them to begin their heroic transformation. And this is the moment for Gilgamesh. They wrestle, right? And when they wrestle, who wins? If you read the story, you might have a feeling as to who wins. It's not very clear. The text doesn't say outright that, so-and-so won, so-and-so lost. But there is an implication in the text. How many get the feeling that Gilgamesh won? How many of you get the feeling that Enkidu won? Right, they're evenly matched, and that's kind of the idea, right? He was made to be the equal of Gilgamesh. And what happens by the end of the fight, they kind of do just stop fighting. But Gilgamesh goes to the knee. He takes a knee, which is a position of submission, essentially. It's a humbling stance. And what he's doing, he's not necessarily recognizing he's been defeated, but he's recognizing he's met his match. He's recognizing, here's a guy I can't beat. We're too evenly matched. And that is a humbling moment because he sees himself the whole time prior as the best. He's unbeatable, right? He can do whatever he wants. Who can stop him? And now he's met somebody that can stop him. All right, and that's an important moment. We'll come back to that later. And he sees in this guy a reflection of himself, and that's attractive to him. All right, it's like looking in the mirror. And this is the neat thing. They become best friends at that point. So here's your first, battle between the superheroes. When they first meet, they got to have the standard battle before they become friends. Right? If you saw Batman v Superman, same type of thing. They got to fight each other, and then they become allies in the end. This is something that's been going on in comic books from the beginning. Right? You always want to see, well, who can beat up who in the superhero realm. But this is not something new. This has been there from the very first hero story. Okay? So he goes from being an adversary to being an ally and a friend and a brother. Okay? So here we go. Enkidu is actually adopted by Ninsun, which is Gilgamesh's mother, so she really refers to him very much like the brother of Gilgamesh, and we're in phase 2. Now, the thing that is a problem for Enkidu is now that he's in the city, he's lost his power. He's lost his connection to the way he used to be in the wild. The ferocious, violent creature now becomes a civilized, weak, soft human being. And that's a problem. It bothers him. And Gilgamesh says, I got a solution to your problem. And all we need to do is just go back into the wilderness, and we got to go kill something. And they're going to pick this poor guy to go kill, but this is the beginning of the first journey, the first quest. And it's a quest not just for the character that they're after to combat, but it's a quest for the lost power, right? It's a quest for something to change oneself, which the quest is always about, transformation. So they're going to take this long journey far away into the cedar forest, and who knows how far that is supposed to be. Mesopotamia is not known for its cedar trees, but the region of Lebanon on the coast of the Levant was a region known very much in the ancient world for its forests and lumber. I think we saw it when we did the story of Isis and Osiris. Remember, Osiris ended up in Byblos, right, inside a tree. So this is probably where Enkidu and Gilgamesh are going to go. So it's a long descent into a dark realm. It's kind of an underworld journey of sorts, though we'll talk about another one later on. And they're going to see Humbaba. Humbaba is the guardian of the forest. And I always feel bad for Humbaba because he's just sitting at home minding his own business while these guys come crashing through his forest, cutting down his trees, and basically knocking on his door, asking him to come out and die. But Humbaba emerges, and Humbaba is big, and he's terrifying. And what's Gilgamesh's initial reaction when he sees this guy come out? It's a pretty standard reaction. I love it when it's fear, right? The actual poet tells you Gilgamesh is afraid. But just for a second, because he goes and attacks him anyways, and he actually has the gods at his back because he uses the power of the wind to kind of push Humbaba up against the wall. And it's not him using the wind the way Marduk used the wind against Tiamat. It's the god Shamash using the wind on Gilgamesh's part. But Humbaba is pushed back by Gilgamesh and held against the wall. And how does Gilgamesh treat him? I think this is the most brilliant part about this combat, which is not a very long or exciting combat. It's actually pretty brief. The whole journey through the woods is kind of fragmentary. It's not even easy to follow what's going on in the poem because the tablets were broken in pieces. But what does he do with him? Does he beat him down? Does he strike him? Does he just, He doesn't stab him just yet. He will eventually kill him. But he does something that's much more subtle when he first pushes him back. He says he slaps him. But how is the slap described? He's not just hauling off and, striking him as hard as he can with the palm of his hand. They said he's slapping him like he was pressing a kiss on his cheek. Right? You get this idea that it's kind of this gentle tapping, almost the way you would treat a child, right? And I think that's the point of it. Here's Gilgamesh, who is treating Humbaba like a child. It's a show of power that's even more a show of power than if he actually used all of his might to slam him to the ground. It's humiliating. And Humbaba reacts by weeping and begging for mercy. And Gilgamesh actually considers letting him go. But Enkidu says, no, we came here to kill him, and they kill him. Okay, so poor Humbaba exits the story pretty quickly. Never does anything to deserve it. But nonetheless, Enkidu is strong again. Gilgamesh and him come back home with the boon that they were after, right? They got their reward, and their reputation is already built up. So by the time they get back to Uruk, who notices Gilgamesh but the goddess of love herself, right? The goddess of Uruk, Ishtar. And she proposes marriage. Should be a compliment. Of course, how does he respond to this marriage proposal, this offer you can't refuse? If we're going to use some mafia terminology. Does Gilgamesh accept the proposal? Is he honored by the proposal? I mean, he tells her no, right? Yeah, he says, yeah. Not only no, I mean, it's worse than that. He says, not only won't I marry you, I'm going to tell you why I won't marry you. It's because all the guys that you've hooked up with before, you end up destroying them. You're just a terrible goddess. And he insults her in the process of doing this. And again, when I say it's an offer you can't refuse, it's because she's not going to let that go. She is now going to punish him for his offense, right? Insulting the goddess, not good. And what she does is she goes and releases a beast into the city of Uruk. And that little impression from a cylinder seal, which is an ancient image of the bull of heaven, perhaps, that's released in Uruk. And this may be a picture of Enkidu and Gilgamesh doing combat with the bull of heaven. Anyways, the bull of heaven is going to wreak havoc in the city, and of course they have to do combat again, and it's, again, a little bit anticlimactic, but they basically kill the bull that she sends, save the city, do the heroic thing, and then the worst thing happens, and this time it's Enkidu who decides to offend the goddess. But how does he offend her? He doesn't just refuse a proposition or a proposal. He actually takes something and effectively slaps her. Yes, he slaps her upside the head with the thigh of the bull, right? So now you're not just insulting the goddess, you're actually assaulting the goddess. And this is kind of a play on the idea of sacrifice, because what you give to the gods is animal sacrifice. We talked about that when we did Prometheus. You take the bull, you kill it, you give a part of it to the god. Here, he's giving a part of it to the goddess, but it's not in the appropriate way, right? He's throwing it in her face. And of course, she's going to get her second revenge, and this time it's worse. What he gets is a curse. He's punished with sickness. Yeah, take this. He's made to fall sick, ill, and this is going to lead to his death. And before he dies, laying weak and sick in bed, it's nothing but regret. He regrets the priestess who came and brought him to the city. He regrets all of this stuff. But it's only briefly. He then kind of takes it back and realizes all the benefits of his friendship with Gilgamesh. And it's an unheroic death, and that's the sad part about it. A hero wants to die the right way, right? Heroes are about teaching us how to die the right way. When we look at the Norse mythology later, it's a big thing in Norse mythology. You need to die in battle if you're going to go up to Valhalla. Okay? If you die here like this, you're not going out on your own terms. There's nothing you can do. There's no fight you can put up. It's humiliating, and it's not only bad for Gilgamesh or for Enkidu, it's also bad for Gilgamesh. And it moves us into stage 3, where he is now a mourner. And he's actually going to remain in stage 3 as he moves further into the story. He's never going to stop mourning the loss of his friend, his brother, the person he cares about the most. This is this grief that he just will not part with. Okay? Now, there's 2 reasons this bothers him so much. Partly because it's the loss of a brother, but it's partly a realization of the frailty of his own life and his own mortality. Okay, and it's his call to adventure. The picture that I'm showing you there is a actual archaeological grave at Ur, the city of Ur, which is a Sumerian city. These are the royal graves at Ur, where you find a lot of interesting grave goods. This is the grave of the lady Puabi, and this is apparently Puabi herself, and the gold headdress and the jewelry that was enclosed. So you can imagine, Enkidu having some kind of burial back in Uruk. But the idea here is Gilgamesh is suffering the loss. And it's not that he doesn't realize he is mortal and will one day die, but it's kind of like when you yourself lose somebody that you care about. There's the loss of somebody you care about, which is painful on its own, but it also causes us very often to reflect on mortality, to reflect on death, right? We all know that we're going to die. We're intellectually aware that we're not going to live forever, but we don't usually think about it very carefully or very deeply until we're in sometimes the funeral service, all right? And we're thinking about this person that we just lost and how short life is. And he's now thinking, yeah, I am going to die. Here's a guy that's just like me, just as powerful, and he couldn't avoid it. What can I do to hopefully avoid it? And he's going to go on this quest for immortality. The ultimate enemy is death, and the ultimate goal is to figure out how to triumph over the grave. Okay? So he will now begin his journey as a seeker, his mystical journey. He's a mystical hero. All right, the quest for immortality, knowledge, and it's his second journey. And this is the real journey that's going to be our descent into darkness. It's a long journey. And he again, doesn't leave his state of mourning. He doesn't shave, he doesn't bathe, he doesn't clean, he doesn't eat, he doesn't drink normal drink. He is just a dirty, ragged individual walking into the wilderness, and you get the picture of him going up into the mountain and down into the valley, where he descends as he's progressing into a darker and darker realm. So it's very vividly this descent into the underworld motif, and he eventually arrives. Yeah, he's going to need to do that, and he will take a bath. He eventually arrives at the hut of Siduri, this little pub on the coast. And Siduri is kind of a goddess figure, gives him a little bit of advice as how he should really just get on with life and enjoy the time that he has in the present. But since he's really interested in figuring out the answer to his question, how to survive death or avoid it, she's going to point him in the direction to somebody who can help him. Now, the ultimate destiny is to go to this place known as Dilmun and meet up with a guy by the name of Utnapishtim. But before he can get there, he needs to go see the boat driver, a guy by the name of Urshanabi. Now, Urshanabi has a boat that can cross over what are called the waters of death. And the boat is there when Gilgamesh arrives, but Urshanabi is not. And in his rage, because he's also not really in very much control of his emotions at this point in the story, he just starts to break things on the front of the boat, these little figurines, these little idols. And Urshanabi eventually arrives and says, you're basically an idiot. Look what you've done to the ship. Those are the things that I need to navigate. You want to go across the water and you've just damaged the boat. What you need to do is go off, cut down some poles so that you can get us across the water. And the necessity of getting these poles, you need like 100-foot poles or 120, 100-foot poles or whatever, is that you can't touch the water with your hands. You can't touch the water in any way because they are the waters of death. And if you touch the water, you will die. So you need these poles to be able to, stick them in the water, push the boat forward, and, you're going to keep using the poles as you go. And this is what he does. He gets the poles, kind of makes like a picket fence across the top of the water as he's going across the waters of death. But he runs out of poles at some point. Takes off his cloak and holds it up like a sail and is propelled by the wind the rest of the way. Now, this journey across the waters of death is a very important image to keep in mind as we talk about the descent into the underworld that we're going to see over and over and over again in these stories. It's called the catabasis. A catabasis, and that's a word that you should know, is a descent. Okay? It's a Greek word. It's a liminal experience. Liminal has to do with the crossing of a threshold, some kind of boundary, something between this world and that. Okay, between the realm that we are in now and the realm that we need to go into to do the transformation. It's kind of like crossing over into the world of adventure when we move from the separation phase into the initiation phase when we talk about the threefold monomyth. So here's our liminal experience. He's crossing the water. The water is a boundary, right, that is difficult to cross, and it involves death. So he's a descent into the realm of the dead. It's a catabasis. There are different levels. These are some signs that you want to pick up on when you see different journeys that are going to fit this motif. You're going to have certain keys, certain things you want to look for. Water is always one of them. Okay, so it usually will take certain stages where you descend through levels or through a certain amount of time that it takes. Like here, you got a 12-day journey. Body of water is pretty common, so if you know anything about entering Hades, you've got the river Styx, you have to cross it, and there's a ferryman who will escort you across. Same thing here with Urshanabi. He's basically the ferryman across the waters to the realm of the dead. It's usually at the end of the world. If you're going to the end of the world, you are going into that other realm, right? This world ends, the next world begins. A lot of times there'll be a garden, which represents life. A lot of times there'll be a tree or a serpent or apples or some fruit. So it's like, again, this idea of immortality at the end of the journey, right? It reminds you, hopefully, of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was a place where there was a tree of life and the fruit and a serpent. And eventually when man was kicked out of it, which we looked at, you have a guardian placed in front, the angel with the flaming sword, so that man can't get back across that boundary again. Okay, Hades has Cerberus, the dog that guards the realm. There's no guard in this particular story, but there's enough to know that we're dealing with an underworld descent as he crosses over the waters of death. And he's going to arrive in a place known as Dilmun, the land of the living, the land where the sun rises. And there's a guy who lives there who he hopes has the answer to his question. This guy's name is Utnapishtim. Now, he's going to be a failure at this point, because when he gets there, he says, Utnapishtim, I've come for the secret of immortality. Tell me how to avoid death. And Utnapishtim gives him an answer. And you think he has the answer because he is immortal. He's a human being who will never die. But his answer comes in the form of a story. What's the story he tells Gilgamesh? You've all heard a version of this story before. Anybody remember? Maybe where you've heard the story? The more famous version, right, it's the flood story. And the flood of Noah is the most famous one that you find in the book of Genesis. This is another version of the story. It's the flood of Utnapishtim. There's also the Atrahasis epic. There's a number of versions, Zusudra. There's several flood stories like this from Mesopotamia, very similar. Anyways, Utnapishtim tells the story. He says, okay, once upon a time, here's his answer, the deluge. Once upon a time, there were the gods who decided to wipe out mankind, in particular the god Enlil, who had it out for human beings because they were too noisy. And he sends this flood to wipe the earth clean so they can get back to this nice peace and quiet that the gods enjoyed. It's a lot like Apsu deciding to kill the younger gods in the Enuma Elish. And he sends the flood. But the god who created mankind, the god Ea, or Enki, depends on your Sumerian or Akkadian version, is hoping to save his creation of humankind. And he comes to Utnapishtim and gives him a warning and tells him to build this boat and gather together the animals and all that kind of stuff. Eventually, the 7 days, 7 nights of rain hit, and everything is wiped out with the exception of the things that are on the boat. And at the end, of course, you have a survivor, Utnapishtim and his wife, and they're granted by the gods immortality. Poor Enlil has to now deal with Utnapishtim forever. And here he lives on this island at the end of the world in peace and paradise for the most part. Now, how is this as an answer? Does it answer his question? I'm sure he's trying to imply something. Might be up to Gilgamesh to figure out how this is an answer. Anybody have an idea? I think we just lost the feed. Hold on one second. All right, the reason it's an answer and what it's implying is that there isn't a secret, okay? There isn't a secret to immortality. The reason Utnapishtim was given immortality is because of this unique situation. The gods just gave it to him. There's nothing he could do to earn it, to attain it, nothing that he can go on a quest for. The gods gave it to him, okay? And if the gods don't give it to Gilgamesh, then of course Gilgamesh will never attain it on his own either. And the chances of another unique situation like a world flood coming along, very remote chance of that happening. So it's kind of like there is no answer. You are going to die a mortal death. Just accept it. Yes, I did, by the way. Just to kind of make it even more vivid, at the very end, he says, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a test. You think you're worthy for immortality. Let's just see you stay awake for 7 days, 7 nights. Now, this test is to show him that he's too frail and weak as a human being to do something like that. How could he possibly ever have life eternal? Okay, now this obviously isn't anything like living. Staying awake for a few days, most of us can do it. But of course, at the end of his journey, he's exhausted. And immediately, he sits down under this tree, and what happens to him? He falls asleep. We've all been in this situation too, where you're just, you're so tired, you're fighting to keep your eyes open. Maybe you're watching a movie with a friend, and you just can't keep your eyes open. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, they're poking you or saying, hey, you're falling asleep. And you always say, no, I wasn't. I wasn't falling asleep. I just closed my eyes for a second. And this is what Gilgamesh pulls. He actually falls asleep. Not only doesn't he stay awake for 10 days and nights in a row, he falls asleep for the entire 7 days, 7 nights in a row. And because they knew he was going to kind of pull something like that, his wife, Utnapishtim's wife, makes bread every day and puts a loaf of bread by his head. And this is real bread. This is not the stuff you get at the supermarket now with all the preservatives. So it goes through various stages of decay, right? It gets stale, it gets mildewy and moldy. And, by the time he wakes up, there's 7 loaves of bread in different stages of decay. So he can't deny it. It's obviously 7 days have passed. He realizes he's a failure. His quest is at an end. He has not attained what he's looking for. So how can I say he's going to end up as an immortal king? Well, let's see how this works out. He starts first to accept his mortality. He accepts his fate. He decides nothing he can do, he's going to deal with it. He bathes, he changes his clothes, he stops mourning the loss of Enkidu, and is going to get on with it. Now, as a consolation prize for just playing the game, Utnapishtim says, I've got a plant that I know of that will give you the next best thing to immortality. It's going to give you youth. Right? It's like the fountain of youth idea. If you find this plant and eat it, you will become young and strong again. Renewal, rejuvenation, a rebirth of sorts. So he tells him where to find this thing. And this plant of youth happens to be located at the bottom of the water. So Gilgamesh goes out there and he ties some rocks around his ankles and, he dives into the water all the way to the bottom. He grabs this plant, brings it up. And what does he do with it when he gets to the surface? Does he eat it? Or does he save it? Now, your text doesn't tell you why he does what he does, but there is an actual answer in the original epic. He doesn't eat it. He puts it down and he goes back to bathe. And while he's away, what does happen to the plant? Something else eats it, right? A serpent comes along and steals from Gilgamesh the secret of youth. Now, in this whole scene, we have him transition into this idea of accepting death. Not only accepting death, he actually embraces death, which is really a powerful moment in the story. And this is how I interpret it, and again, there could be other interpretations of what's going on here. And I don't think a lot of people pick up on what's going on in this scene. Symbolically, there's an action he does that shows him embracing death, not just accepting it. And it's not bathing. It's not changing his clothes. In a way, it's bathing. The thing that he does that shows him embracing death in a new way is going down for the plant. Now, why is that the case? It's because, again, it's a descent. Not only is it a descent, down to the bottom of the water, it's a descent into a particular body of water that we've already been introduced to in the story. He is jumping into the waters of death. The very waters he was told he could not touch or he will die when he took the boat to Dilmun. Now he's not only touching it, he's diving to the very bottom of the waters of death. Now, if that's not a symbol of his embracing his fate, I don't know what is. The thing that I think makes people miss this fact is the idea that he comes back to the surface and we see him go on in the story fully alive. So why can we say, you'll die if you touch the waters of death? Well, if you go back and remember the story of the Garden of Eden, we talked about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the warning that God gave to Adam was, if you eat of the fruit, what will happen? The day you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, of course, he eats the fruit. Him and Eve eat the fruit, and they don't die immediately, depending on what you mean by death. Because remember, death could be a metaphor. And in a certain way, Adam and Eve do die because they're cut off from the world that they were in. And they will die, yes, physically, eventually. And they're definitely cut off from the relationship they once had with God, which is a type of death, right? God representing life and then being cut off from that life. So it's a spiritual death. Okay, for Gilgamesh, I think it's the same type of idea. It's a recognition of his mortality, his embracing his mortality, his accepting of the fact that he will die and not resisting it. So in a way, this whole descent into the water and coming back up is a conquest of death moment, right? These stories have to have a conquest of death. And I think this is a very powerful symbolic one. And it's going to wrap up his transformation. And even more so, we need to talk about the serpent and what has happened in this scene where the serpent steals the plant. It's immediately rejuvenated, right? The serpent, again, is not just a symbol of death and chaos the way Tiamat was, but it's a symbol of life. The shedding of the skin is this idea of rebirth, right? Renewal. And of course, that's there to show you that the plant actually works. In Gilgamesh, he's pretty broken up about it. But what they don't tell you in your text is why he did not eat the plant, right? There's no reason he needed to wait. There's no reason he needed to save it for later. It's not like it was going to necessarily wear off. Okay. Plus, he's got a big journey ahead of him. Might as well eat it and get ready to go back on the journey to Uruk. But the text actually does tell us why he didn't eat it, and your version doesn't. And this is a shame because this might be the most important part of the whole story. The text says, the actual poem says, he does not eat the plant because he wanted to save it for the old men back home in the city. Now, why is this so important? Who cares about the old men back home? Well, Gilgamesh does. And I think that's the completion of the transformation, right? Because Gilgamesh, in the opening part of the story, did he care about the old men of Uruk? Yeah, it shows selflessness exactly as opposed to his selfishness. That's exactly the point. He didn't care at all about his people, yet at the very end of his journey, he's thinking about the people. He's being selfless for the first time. He's going to save it for them, okay, before he tasted of himself. That's a different person. That's the reason we can talk about him becoming immortal, not in a physical sense, not like Idnapishtim. His immortality is going to come because he has earned for himself a moment of glory, a reputation, a memory that people will want to preserve. He's not the same man, and that's the key. If he was the man he was in the beginning of the story, when he died, the people of Uruk would wipe his memory from existence. They wouldn't tell stories about him. They would not allow him to live on in glory and in fame and in reputation. But because he's a different man, because he's the type of king that they could admire, now they're going to tell his story. Now he's going to attain glory, memory, And it's neat the way the poem opens and closes with kind of these bookend references to the walls of the city, kind of a monument to the king, that he built this city. Look at the great thing that he left behind. They're singing his praises. It's not the same man. It's the brilliance of the story, I think. So it's interesting. It's the earliest epic we have, but you should not think at any point that this is some kind of primitive story that doesn't have some really deep points to it. This is a brilliant story. Anyways, let's go a little further because I've got more to cover and we're running out of time. But let's talk about this whole idea of catalyst for transformation, the adversary. How important is Enkidu for the story? I think he's essential, right? You start with the abusive king who is selfish. He's a person that is inward facing. He is lover of himself only. He sees everything else as other, right? He doesn't see himself in anything else. He's the best. They're able to be stepped upon. They're just tools for his self-gratification, or however you want to put it. Now, he's introduced to Enkidu. The reason he's a catalyst, the reason he's the element that begins the transformation is because he is other. He is not Gilgamesh, but he is enough like Gilgamesh that he can be seen as another self, right? So he's both like Gilgamesh, but unlike Gilgamesh. He's both self and other at the same time. And when Gilgamesh sees him and he sees his reflection in him, he realizes, here's somebody I can love, right? If he loves himself, of course he's going to love Enkidu too, because he's just like him. So as soon as he's now able to put his, or care rather, about somebody other than himself, it's kind of off in the right direction. He's going to move forward in the story till eventually he gets to this diving into the water, this completion of the transformation. This whole phase is our initiation phase. This is Act 2 of the hero story, right? From the instance you meet Enkidu to the completion of the journey. And then he returns, and he returns as a selfless king who is looking outward. He cares about other people fully, and he's sacrificial in his own willingness to put his own desires aside. So again, there's the threefold structure: abusive king, you've got the separation, you have the initiation, the whole story in between, and then at the end, a return to Uruk. Right? It's very brief. The return to Uruk is just the little last tail end of the story. But again, you don't need much. Most of the story is always going to be the initiation phase. All right, so that's our first story. One last thing to point out before we look at Chi Li is this whole idea of wild versus civilized. I like this aspect of the story as well, because when you look at the transformation, both of Enkidu and Gilgamesh, it's a transformation from wild to civilized. Enkidu is a minor version of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh has a major transformation. It's kind of done in a way where, again, Gilgamesh's transformation bookends Enkidu's. It's like a story within a story. Enkidu moves from wild to civilized, and in the process he loses something, his power. And then Gilgamesh moves from wild to civilized, and in the process gains something, which is glory. Okay? Enkidu's transformation is Gilgamesh's transformation on a small scale. Now, when I call Gilgamesh wild, I'm talking about how he behaves within society, right? Enkidu was a wild man in the wilderness, and when he comes to the city, he loses that aspect of himself. And this is where we get into this whole idea of a mediation of opposites. If you ever study mythological theory, you may come across a theory called structuralism. Claude Levi-Strauss introduces this idea. He believes all myth is a way to analyze opposites, duality and struggle between these contradictory ideas, and the story kind of works out some kind of mediation between them. So we can look at the story as a mediation between the wild versus the civilized. And then here's the hero figure who fits in between the two. He's a transitional figure. Like I said, the hero stands between nature out there and culture in here. He's the thing that provides protection for the people in here, but he has to often go out into the wilderness to do that, right? The monster slayer type, even the warrior type. So here's the real conflict that the hero has to deal with, and Gilgamesh deals with it in this story. The characteristics that make somebody a great hero are not the same characteristics that are going to make that person well suited to survival and participation in society. Because what does a hero, especially a monster slayer, have to be? Has to be wild, has to be violent, has to be the type of thing that's not afraid to take life. Okay? And the hero can't be like that within society. So the very characteristics that make them successful as a hero often are going to make them a failure in society. And that's what Gilgamesh was. He was a wild man trying to rule a city, and it was a disaster. Okay? He needed to get rid of that aspect of his personality in order to become a good king. This is necessary. The violence is necessary for the survival of society, but it's not necessary inside society. We even look at this idea or this theme when it comes to we'll see it definitely in other stories, so pay attention for that when we get to Heracles and Achilles and on. Throughout the semester, we're going to see this over and over again, but we can even think about conditions today when you may hear of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? This phenomenon that we see servicemen coming back home after some kind of experience in war. And this isn't new. This goes all the way back to Gilgamesh. This goes back to warfare from every generation throughout history. When you're called upon to do something like go to war and kill other human beings, it requires you to do things that you don't do in the ordinary everyday life. This is actually not only not done in everyday ordinary life, it's something that's obviously frowned upon, right? It's forbidden to take life within a society. Yet you're called upon to do the very thing you've been trained never to do in your normal life. And there's got to be this, split in your emotions. It's kind of a pulling in both directions. And after you do something or even see certain things that are so horrific, you have a difficult time, coming back to the world you left. This is a struggle for a lot of people. There's, counseling to help people through this type of a thing. But I think mythology has been helping people in a way deal with this throughout history as well, right? We talked about mythology having a function of, kind of a pedagogical function, leading you through transitions in life, whether it's an initiation ritual or even dealing with this aspect of society, the idea of warfare. So I think that's another example of the wild versus civilized. How do you reconcile different conflicting aspects within a single human persona? And I think Gilgamesh is one of the first places we actually see a really well done introduction to that theme. Okay, so it's a pretty profound epic. All right, let's talk a little bit about Chi Li, and then I'll just talk about the comparisons between the two characters. If you haven't read the story, please do. It's only a couple pages long. It's a wonderful story. It might remind you of the story of Mulan. I noticed somebody also put the word Mulan up there in the text. I don't know if you were already referring to Chi Li or something we were talking about earlier. But the story goes back to about the 4th century AD. It's from China. It's found in a work called The Records of Researches into Spirits by Kang Pao. I apologize for my pronunciation of Chinese names. I do not speak the language. But it was a compilation of myths and legends. And the three main characters are Chi Li, Tan Li, and the young serpent. Okay, Chi Li is the daughter, Tan Li is the father, and then the young serpent is the villain of the story. It's basically a monster, but it's not just a monster. He's a dragon, and it's an intelligent dragon, as we've seen before. Serpents can be crafty, wily, and we get a clue as to him being intelligent because he communicates to the people through dreams, right? It's an oracular dream that is received that tells people exactly what he wants. He's going to destroy society and wreak havoc on the population unless he's given a particular offering once every year, and it's been going on now for 9 years. It's the sacrifice of a maiden, a virgin young girl. And if he gets that, then he's going to leave people on their own. Now, this is a fertility myth, and we're going to see lots of dragon slayer stories. We've already seen Marduk and Tiamat. This is our second exposure, but it's a pretty common motif. We'll see more as we go further forward. Now, the serpent very often is intelligent. And here, the girls that have been offered every year are the undesirables. The government picks daughters of slaves and criminals, people that are not going to be missed. And it's even worse than that because the idea is not only are these particular girls useless and unvaluable, you get the idea that women in general are not valued in the culture of the time. Now, this is expressed actually by Chi Li, right? And we're going to start to see an investigation of the morality of the people, the virtues and values of the society. Because here's Chi Li, who's a young girl. You guys can tell me in the text if you remember a little bit about her family. She's a girl. She's weak. She's young. And she decides she's going to volunteer to be the sacrifice on this 10th year. And she figures this is going to be a benefit not only to the community, because it'll save everybody for another year, but it's going to be a benefit to her father. and her family. And why is that? It's because they're a poor family, right? And here's her dad, who's poor not only financially, but poor because he has had the unfortunate situation where he has, 7 daughters? And she's the youngest of the 7? If I get the number right, I believe it's 7. Correct me if I'm wrong in the text. And she says, daughters are not valuable. Sons are valuable. And not only is she a daughter, which is bad enough on its own, but she's the youngest of the daughters. And they're a poor family. He's not going to miss one unvaluable child, one small, insignificant child. As a matter of fact, it's one less mouth to feed. So whether this does its job or not, at least it's going to save us, the family some food. So she expresses this. She's expressing the view of the culture. And Townley is the interesting one because he is now going to respond in an unusual way. He says, no, you're completely wrong. Not only are my daughters valuable to me, he says, I love all of my daughters equally, youngest to oldest, as if they were boys. There's no difference in his mind between a son or a daughter. They all have equal value. So he's in a way challenging the cultural viewpoint in asserting this new value. So he's really a role model here. Now we're going to see how Chi Li is going to, take this information and do something with it for the audience. She's going to, first of all, disobey her father. Right? So again, she's expressing the values, he's challenging the values, and then she's going to go pull the Mulan. She's going to go off and do what she wanted to do nonetheless. And she has a plan of attack. She actually goes to her grandmother and she says, I'm going to go sacrifice myself to the dragon. And her grandmother says, here's a sword that belonged to your great-grandfather. Take this with you. Now, because she's planning on doing this, she has the foresight enough to get ready to do this. Apologize for the noise out there. She volunteers. And she's going to ask from the magistrates a few requests. She says, allow me 3 things. Allow me, and I don't remember if I put these in the PowerPoint. I don't. Okay. So her quest, again, is to sacrifice herself to save society. She has the vision, the preparation. She's got the sword, and she's now going to ask for a hound, a serpent hound, which they're going to give her. She says she wants permission to use the sword that her grandmother gave her. They grant her permission to use the sword. And then she asks for the freedom to use these things. Okay? Now, when you get to that particular phrase in the text, a lot of times the students get confused. What does that mean? The freedom to use them. And I usually ask that of the students, and almost invariably the students are going to say, well, she wants permission to use the dog and the sword. And that's actually not it at all. Because just the fact that they give her a dog and allow her to carry the sword with her, it's kind of implicit that she has permission to use those things. When she says, allow me the freedom to use them, I think it's much more practical. She's asking not to be tied up. Because if you remember, all of the girls brought to the cave for the dragon are tied to a post in the front so that they don't run away, which is what you need to do. Because if the dragon doesn't get a sacrifice, he's going to kill everybody else in the village. So they're tied, they're bound at the mouth of the cave. So she says, at least trust me. I'm volunteering. Trust me that I'm not going to run. And they do this. Okay. Now they do watch from the distance to make sure she doesn't cut out at the last moment. Because when we first see the dragon emerge, and this is an underworld journey if you haven't caught it, all right? The mouth of the cave is the entrance to the underworld, and out of the cave comes the beast from the underworld. And it's larger than she expected. It's terrifying, and she has fear. Just like Gilgamesh, the story of Chi Li says she is afraid when she sees it. But she leaves behind these rice balls, something else that her grandmother gave her, which are a lure. The dragon's busy smelling the rice balls, comes out a little bit distracted. She releases the dog. She jumps on the back of the dragon's head with the sword. She kills it and achieves her victory, right? And then she enters the cave, the belly of the beast, where she retrieves the skulls of these young girls. And immediately she gives them this unfortunate lecture as to how pathetic they were and how they went to their death and they could have done something better than they did. It's almost unfair because these poor girls, number one, didn't volunteer. They were picked against their will and tied up. But the point of the whole monologue is, you could have done something. A single person can make a big difference if you have the foresight to act and not be afraid. So there's a lesson in there. And of course, she's going in the to get the skulls to give them proper burial, which would be a proper customary thing to do. Anyways, the story ends up as kind of a happy story, happy ending, right? She ends up marrying the king. Her father becomes a magistrate in the village and in the county, Changlo County, and happily ever after, which is kind of cool. And I don't know if I pointed this out. Yeah, she does pull a Mulan, exactly. Which, by the way, I heard there's a new live-action version of that film. I haven't seen it yet. The animated feature is wonderful that Disney did. I don't know if anybody's seen the live-action one, but text me if you've seen it, whether you think it's good or bad. But anyways, a happy ending, which I should have pointed out the same thing in Gilgamesh. Even though he ends up as a failure at the end of Gilgamesh, the story has a happy ending, right? He attains what he's after. You have a memory that's passed on. We could say in classical terms that both of these stories are comedies, right? They're not tragedies. They end up on a high note, right? They're not funny stories, but they're comedic in the classical sense of ending up, again, at a positive spot. So some epics are going to be comedies. I think some epics are tragedies. It really depends. Follow the stories as we read them. You're going to be able to tell whether it ends on a high note or a down note, whether it's a comedy or tragedy. But these two today are both comedies. Okay, so let's talk about the parallel between the two. Not only are they both comedies, but we want to look at the types of characters they are as heroes. We looked at essential and accidental characteristics of heroism, so let me bring up the essential characteristics of being a role model, extraordinary courage, and being a savior or provider for life. We said those are essential. The accidental characteristics, or some of the common ones, are being semi-divine, being noble, great size, great strength, and having some kind of God on your side, divine favor. Now let's look at Gilgamesh first and see how he checks off the boxes. Clearly, he's a role model with extraordinary courage, and he saves his people from the bull of heaven at least. He also has all the accidental features, right? He's half God, actually 2/3 God. He's a king. He's larger, more strong than the average person. He has the god like Shamash help him in his battle with Humbaba, right? So he's got all the boxes checked. He's a standard hero figure that we're going to see plenty of in the stories we're going to deal with. But what about Chi Li? Here's a character that is a brilliant example of heroism. And the reason I included it is because it's going to be an exception to the general rule we're going to see. Number one, it's a female hero. We're not going to see a lot of them because there aren't as many female hero stories in world literature as there are stories of male heroes. There are some. Lots of cultures have them. The Norse tradition has plenty. We'll actually see some interesting ones there. We'll talk about Atalanta later, maybe when we talk about the Argonauts. So even the Greeks have female heroes. But Chi Li is unique in that she checks off the major boxes. She's a role model, right? At the end of the story, not only does she prove her father right, well, I mean, that's the gist of it, right? She has asserted the cultural viewpoint that women are not important, but by the end of the story, she's proved that that cultural viewpoint is wrong, that there is value in women and girls. Okay, the exact thing her father was saying, she proves him right. So she's a role model for sure. She's an example of extraordinary courage, and she saves everybody by the end of the story. But when you go to the other characteristics, she's got none of these. She's not divine. There's no mention of it. She's from a poor family. She's not upper class. She is smaller. She is weaker than the average person. And there's no mention of the gods helping her out in the least. She's on her own. Okay, but yet she is a great example of heroism, which is why I said those essential characteristics are the ones we're looking for. The other ones, take them or leave them, they're not as important. So as we go through the rest of the characters this semester, I want you to think again about those essential characteristics and ask yourself, does this character fit? Are they a role model? Did they do the courageous act? Did they save everybody? Now, some of the characters we're going to read about that have been called heroes in a traditional sense, you might find that they don't measure up in the end. I've got one particular character that's coming to mind. We'll see who that is later. But you may agree that, that character, not really a hero. Okay, so pay attention to those little characteristics. They're really, really important. That's a lengthy overview of Gilgamesh. I think I went through this a little bit more quickly than I did with the last time I gave this lecture to a class. So hopefully it made sense. Hopefully you actually appreciated the Epic of Gilgamesh now more than you might have when you first read it. And if you haven't yet read it, read it. Have some of these things in the back of your mind as you're reading it. I think you're going to appreciate the story more. And where we're going from here, we're going to move away from a very old, the oldest hero story of Gilgamesh. And the next lecture that I'm going to do for you guys has to do with a very modern hero, the figure of Batman. We're going to be dealing with the movie Batman Begins and analyzing that as a hero's journey. So that will be next time.